It all started when someone told them that our church was still gathering and every day they have a service. They knew about it. Armed men in black uniforms broke into the church and stopped the service. They began interrogating our pastor. They were looking for anything that could be connected to the United States. And they said that you will no longer gather here. We are shutting down your services, closing your house of prayer. And you're not allowed to gather here or even at your homes.
Russia has brought destruction and death to Ukraine. Evangelical Christians are deemed heretics and American spies. Many are arrested, tortured, and killed. For those living in occupied Ukraine, their only hope is that God will answer their silent prayers.
No, two gone. What? Both of you.
Well, when the war first started, I had no intention of becoming involved with any sort of efforts to do anything in Ukraine. And that changed fairly quickly when a friend that I was talking to about the situation pointed out that there was going to be a massive human cost to the war, and that there were going to be many innocent people, children, vulnerable families that were going to suffer as a result of Russia's invasion. And that got me thinking in a different way about things. And eventually I became involved through a missionary friend who had an opportunity to help on the border. And when I got to the border, I saw with my own eyes what was going on and decided to continue my involvement helping with Ukraine. I think the best symbol that I've found of this war is this children's book that I found in a bookstore in Kiev. And the obvious story in this book is about a family that finds an unexploded grenade in their yard. And then the grenade is eventually exploded in their house. And the point of the book, clearly, is to teach young children that if they find unexploded munitions, to leave them alone in order to preserve their own lives, which I think is a tragedy, that rather than learning their ABCs or reading fairy tales, these kids are having to learn how to not be blown up by what the Russian army has left in their cities and in their villages. But beyond the general human cost of the war, I was surprised to find that evangelicals were intentionally being targeted by Russian forces in the occupied zones. And we talked to a pastor, Sergei from Kharkiv, who told us about his church and how they had been targeted by Russian intelligence. Tell us about your experience with the war beginning in 2014, before the full-scale invasion.
As I'm trying to reflect on that time, 2014, it was very confusing, very terrifying, yet incomprehensible. Cities like Sloviansk, Donetsk, and Luhansk had already been occupied. And one day, this disaster came to our city, Starobilsk, where I was carrying out my pastoral ministry. Armed Russian soldiers forced their way into the city. They tore down all Ukrainian flags. By then, there were no longer any law enforcement or persecutors left in the city, just armed Russian soldiers walking the streets. And then the head of the Starobilsk district administration called me and invited me to his office. He said, "Sergei Ivanovich, yesterday Mozgovoi and his men were in my office. In 2014, Mozgovoi was one of the field commanders on the side of the so-called LPR. They came to my office, pulled back the bolts on their rifles, and pressed two automatic weapons against my ribs. They had two demands. The first demand was to have a referendum in Starobilsk city. And their second demand was that your church must disappear from here entirely. They called us American spies and gave us 2 days. 2 days to leave the city. If we weren't gone within 2 days, they said they would execute us, my entire family, and our entire church.
At Pastor Sergei's church, we also met a woman named Olena who had been widowed. Her husband, Yura, was a pastor and a chaplain who had been killed in a Russian airstrike directly on their church building in Kupiansk just a few months earlier.
On February 28th, we had a prayer service praying for Ukraine. Then, after the service, Yura and two deacons stayed in the garage to repair our car. Other people from the congregation had already left at 1 o'clock, but at 1:30, an airstrike hit the church. Everything was completely destroyed. Every single fragment was shattered. The garage was completely obliterated. Two deacons who were repairing the car were wounded by shrapnel, and my Yura was killed. His injuries were fatal. So,
Pastor Sergei and Olena's stories were unfortunately not unique. Within their own denomination, we interviewed a pastor named Volodymyr. He had started a chaplain organization to serve soldiers on the front lines, and because of this, his name was placed on a hit list by Russian intelligence.
Approximately an hour after Russian troops invaded our village, we heard a knock on our window. 8 soldiers armed with rifles came into our house and commanded us to go outside. They told me to walk ahead, while one of them followed behind. As we walked, I heard him pull back the bolt on his rifle. Then there was a click, but no shot followed. He pulled the bolt back again, another click, but again no shot. He removed the magazine, turned to the others and said, "Watch this, the magazine is full, but for some reason it won't fire."
Some of those who we interviewed were not able to show their identities because of their connections to churches that were still under Russian occupation. For instance, we interviewed a pastor who had been accused falsely of having connections to the United States simply because his church was an evangelical church.
Well, it all started when Russian soldiers and special forces units showed up. They broke into our church and began a search operation. They were looking for anything that could be connected to the United States. We had already been warned that similar searches had taken place in other churches, looking for any ties to America. When they arrived, they told us that our church would be shut down anyway. 2 months after they had broken in to search and loot the church, someone told them that our congregation was still gathering to worship every day. They knew about it, so they arrived just as the service was taking place. Men in black uniforms with assault rifles broke into the church and stopped the service. They began interrogating our pastor and told him, "You will no longer gather here. We are shutting down your services and closing your house of prayer. You are not allowed to gather, not only here, but even at your homes." It was a direct order.
The key elements of the Russian occupation forces strategy seem to be that when they would enter an area, they would identify any evangelical Protestant church leadership. They would interrogate that leadership, possibly invite them to collaborate and serve Russian intelligence. And if they refused to collaborate, they would ban those churches from meetings, potentially confiscate their building, and force church members to meet only in secret. Was your church allowed to meet under occupation?
People continued to gather for about 2 more months, but then the church was confiscated. So our congregation continued to meet in their homes, but they were profiled and tracked down. There were many Protestant churches in Kupiansk, but almost all of them left. Only those who agreed to cooperate with the occupation authorities remained.
For many of the church leaders who refused to collaborate with occupation forces, their church buildings and homes were seized by the Russian army and repurposed for military use.
Russian soldiers demanded the keys to the church, and we had no choice but to give them up. So now in the house of prayer of Novopskov, there are Russian soldiers stationed, just like in the prayer house of Pastor Volodymyr in Holubivka. And as you already know, our church in Kupiansk was destroyed by a direct hit from an air bomb. Our pastor Yura was killed, and all that was left of that church are ruins.
As our interviews went on, I felt that I had to ask some very pointed questions, just to be certain that some of the things that had happened were not merely the normal collateral damage of war. Do you believe that the Russian military intentionally targeted your evangelical church with a bomb?
Yes. Yes, I do. Because we had a large garage. A lot of soldiers would come to fix their cars there. Our church was a humanitarian hub. People came there to receive humanitarian aid and to hear God's word. They could take a break and recharge mentally. Many said that when they came to church, they could forget about the war for a few hours.
Do you believe that the Russian state wants to eliminate Protestant Christianity from the occupied territories?
Protestant churches have shown their strength during this war. That is why in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, pastors were executed, deacons and church leaders were murdered. To them, Protestants are like a red rag to a bull.
What happened to the people from your church who decided to stay?
Yes, unfortunately there was a tragic story. 3 members of our church spent about 6 months in the basements of the LPR. They were imprisoned because of their beliefs, primarily because they belonged to a Protestant church. And in the eyes of the occupiers, Protestantism is an American faith. And we are American spies sent here to destroy the Orthodox faith. This is what the Russians believe. And of course, because our brothers have a pro-Ukrainian stance, the love for their country and their people.
We know many people who disappeared under occupation, For example, one of my friends, recently we received a message that she died in prison under torture. Her body was returned to her family for burial. She had been falsely accused of espionage and held in prison for over a year. Her family received a phone call to come and collect her body. She was murdered.
Due to my involvement with evangelical missionary work over the last 20 years, I've spent a considerable amount of time praying for and visiting persecuted Christians around the world. And I believe that what's going on in occupied Ukraine at the hands of Russia is one of the worst persecutions of evangelical Christians in the 21st century.
This is not simply a war, not only a war of a big country against a small country, Russia against Ukraine. This is a war of darkness against light.
War always leaves a scar. This war has changed a lot of things. It has shown us who is a friend and who is an enemy. It has given us many new friends. This war has erased the borders between the West, East, North, and South. On the one hand, war is blood and suffering. But on the other hand, it is also a time when people unite.
Західні держави пізнають і щораз краще розуміють правдиву суть російського імперіалізму і комунізму. Політика поступок, співжиття і примирення не заспокоїла Москви, не спиняє її дальшого агресивного наступу в різних напрямах. Ця політика остаточно збанкрутувала. У світі щораз більше зростає свідомість, що стримати імперіалістичний наступ можна тільки рішучим опором і відпором.